witches remain in popular culture today as something of a role model, something of an avatar for thinking about women's rights and what women might be allowed to do and not allowed to do, what kind of powers they're allowed to keep and which powers they must give away or compromise. Magic stands in for feminine power in so many different ways. Hello, I'm Professor Marion Gibson and welcome to the fourth and final talk about witchcraft in history. Today we're going to look at witchcraft today. I'm sure that you will have come across the word witch. I started at the beginning of the course by asking you what you thought a witch was, and some of you might have thought about witchcraft in the news today. Barely a day goes by that somebody does not say they are the victim of a witch hunt. And they might tweet that, or they might say it in a statement, or it might appear in a news article. Pretty much every couple of weeks, somebody sends me from somewhere around the world a little story about how somebody, often a politician or somebody who's on trial for something, has said, I'm the victim of a witch hunt. And quite often it's somebody who patently isn't the victim of a witch hunt, but chooses to present themselves in the role of a witch. I think that's really interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but also we can see witches in other areas of modern culture too. So we see them in films, we see them in TV shows, we see them on posters, we see them in advertising. There is a big splurge at the moment of novels about witchcraft from the past, whether those are historical novels about witch trials or whether they're really about the image of the witch as an empowering and magical woman. We can think about magical realism, which is a genre of writing where essentially you're telling an ordinary realist story, but somebody suddenly decided to practice magic during the course of it. So we can talk about all of those things. And I think the witch is still very present in contemporary society. It's present in Western societies, but it's also present around the world today. And I do want to finish up by talking about the ways that people are still being prosecuted for witchcraft. That's something that's happening all around the world. And I think it's something we need to think about alongside the many images of witches in popular culture, which are often surprisingly positive ones. One of the ways witches get reinvented happens during the 19th century, and it's by people like this man, James George Frazer, an anthropologist and ethnographer in the late Victorian period, who, like many others of his time, becomes interested in what he sees as survivals of witch belief and magical belief into modern times. He and many others became collectors of folklore about these matters. So if they knew of a story of a witch trial, or if they knew that somebody had been accused of witchcraft in a community and was being rumoured to be a witch, even though they could no longer be put on trial in the late 19th century, or if they heard a story about a magical artefact or were able to collect something for a museum which was said to have magical powers, then they would do that. And they're very interested in witchcraft and magic because they're living in that late Victorian period when people are starting to ask the first questions about whether the Christian story of the creation of Adam and Eve is in fact true, or whether that new theory by Mr. Charles Darwin and others is the correct one. You know, are we evolutionists or are we creationists? It's something that preoccupies the Victorians increasingly. They live in a very religious society, very much like the one that we've talked about in the medieval and early modern period, where it is assumed that God is in charge of everything, perhaps increasingly less assumed that the devil is a major factor in modern life. But nevertheless, things are thought to be going forward according to God's plan. But of course, what if it's an evolutionary plan instead? What if things are random? They are not chosen, they are not willed by a supreme being. What if, nevertheless, even if you believe in that world of science, there are still strange forces operating around you? Lots of Victorian people believed in spiritualism, so the ability of some people to be mediums for the voices of the dead coming back from the beyond. Lots of people believed in occultism and magic. Some people were even starting to found new versions of religion, which were not Christian, but were much more like old pagan religions. Some of them based on ancient Greek paganism, some of them on what they thought the Anglo-Saxons had been up to in their magical practices, some of what they thought the Celts had been up to in their magical practices. So there's a whole range of religious experimentation in this period. And scientists, anthropologists, ethnographers like James George Frazer start thinking about the ways that those stories of magic have shaped human culture. What if you could trace a kind of evolution in those stories in much the same way that Charles Darwin has traced an evolution in physical, biological forms? What if you could learn about the history of humanity by looking at points where people had believed very strongly in magic or witchcraft and where they'd taken social action about it? And what if you could say more about modern society by looking at people who still believed in those old ideas? So one of the ways that witchcraft makes its transition into modern culture, and especially popular culture, is through the work of anthropologists, ethnographers, and other theorists of magic, including folklorists. Another of the ways that witchcraft gets into modern culture is by popular histories and books about witches such as this one, The Dark World of Witches by Eric Maple. There were a big splurge of these in the mid-20th century where people looked at what they thought to be survivals of witchcraft, but also increasingly started to study modern pagans. And over time, a kind of satanic panic developed where people began to think that, oh yes, there had actually been witches, and yes, they were still active in modern society, including in groups of perfectly harmless pagans who were just interested in a different type of religiosity. So there's a lot of popular histories of witchcraft that become very popular in the mid-20th century. And a final way in which witchcraft enters, if you like, the modern cultural bloodstream is by novels. Here's Ye Little Salem Maid by Pauline Bradford Mackey. And that's an early example of somebody writing a historical novel, in this case about the Salem trials. These become incredibly popular too. People really want to read about the history of witch trials. That's something that's still going on today, and it's partly why you're here. They're fascinating, aren't they? People want to think about the human motivations behind them, the terrible suffering of the victims who were put on trial, the difficulties that the court had in making evidential judgments, why people in the first place would decide that their child or their cow or their farm had been damaged by magic, and what we could say in creative writing about the ways in which this played out and what it told us about the societies of the past and today. So people wrote a lot of novels, and they still do today, about witches, witch trials, and the ways in which the witch continues to be relevant now. The film and TV industry has a huge part to play in the popularisation of these kind of novels, these kind of anthropological theories and dark stories about the world of witches. In the 1940s, people first start thinking about ways in which they could make popular feature films about witchcraft. Since the very origins of cinema, people have been interested in showing magic on screen because it's spectacular, right? And once they realise that there are tricks that you can do with cameras, such as cutting, then moving people about, and then cutting back again, they get very excited about the idea that you can make impossible things happen. You can make people appear and disappear. You can make people appear to turn into animals. You can make people fly through the air if you have the right theatrical equipment, and you can film it. So it's been very exciting to cinematic pioneers right from the birth of cinema. But in the 1940s, people want to make the first feature-length films about witches, and they start with Salem. This is something that really starts in North America. One of the first films is 1942's I Married a Witch, and it's followed up by a whole slew of others, very, very popular. Starred two of the big stars of its time, Veronica Lake and Frederick March. And by the 1950s, you've got people like James Stewart, you've got people like Kim Novak starring in witchcraft films, in this case, Bell, Book and Candle from the mid-1950s. You've also got interest in witchcraft in the theatre as well. Arthur Miller's play The Crucible belongs to that early 50s period. And the witches that you see in these dramas are very diverse. In the cinema, they're often quite pleasing witches. So you're looking at images of beautiful women in beautiful clothing, played by your famous star actors. And they're seen as role models in some ways. Yes, there is, if you like, mild peril, where at the beginning of the story, quite often the witch is seen as a potentially threatening figure. She is independent. She's got her own life. She maybe keeps a shop or has a business. Maybe she's problematic in some way. She's come back from the past to wreak revenge on those who had her executed in the 17th century. That kind of story. But as the story goes on, these films very often develop into a romantic comedy, whereby the witch finds a mortal man, falls in love with him and marries him, losing her powers in the course of that transition. And this is something that carries on into the really popular American TV show of the 60s and 70s, Bewitched, where the witch Samantha does indeed marry a mortal man. But by the 60s and 70s, it was becoming increasingly clear that women were dissatisfied with fictions in which they had to give away all their power in order to get married and form a relationship. So in that case, in Bewitched, the witch does get to keep her powers. And this is something that really influences modern television and film too. In the 1990s, there's another group of these witch rom-coms, if you like. There's a remake of Bewitched in the early 21st century, but thinking back to the 1990s, there's the film Practical Magic with Nicole Kidman and Sandra Bullock, and there's things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the very long-running show in which the witch character Willow is a key part and develops over the course of the show into a really interesting, empowered character. So witches remain in popular culture today as something of a role model, something of an avatar for thinking about women's rights and what women might be allowed to do and not allowed to do, what kind of powers they're allowed to keep and which powers they must give away or compromise. Magic stands in for feminine power in so many different ways. And it's the same in religion too. A lot of the religious groups who've embraced the label witch today are thinking about female power and are thinking about a kind of anti-patriarchal religion that they might want to explore. So the witch gets into contemporary culture as a positive figure, partly because of all those novels from the past that we've talked about earlier, where witches are seen as essentially a rather interesting phenomenon that might tell us something about the history of woman and the history of society. However, witches still remain scary too. So I'm sure you can think of some of these that you may have seen yourself from the 1960s and 70s. There are a range of really quite unpleasant films like Witchfinder General, like The Blood on Satan's Claw, like The Wicker Man, where groups of people who are associated with witchcraft and magic and have different beliefs from the Christian mainstream are seen as profoundly threatening. Some of them are films where there is real magical power. Well, the devil really has been raised and contacted, and this gets more and more the case as you look through the 1980s at the so-called video nasties, where there's quite often a satanic element and where there is a lot of blood and gore associated with that satanic element. People are sacrificed to the devil, babies are kidnapped, people are tortured, and so on. So the witch remains as a threatening figure in modern culture too, and that's also carried on. So in fictions like American Horror Story Coven, for example, or The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, a remake of the really rather nice 90s series Sabrina the Teenage Witch, which was all very safe and domestic. The recent remake in 2018 to very recently has shown a very different side to witchcraft, which is a lot more macabre and a lot more threatening, and perhaps a lot more interesting for all of those reasons. The witch remains with us today as a frightening figure. And I think that's important. I think there's something in the human imagination, and maybe this is a takeaway from the course, that continues to go back to the idea that other human beings are a terrible threat, that we need scapegoats. And some of those scapegoats will be imagined to be empowered by magic. Around the world today, hundreds of people are put on trial as witches every year. Sometimes these are formal trials run by states and churches, but much more often they're informal trials. People are put on trial and they are killed by their neighbours. And this is a terrible thing that I feel we ought to be doing more about. Witchcraft trials are on the rise around the world today, and the witch is still with us. I hope you've enjoyed these last 4 weeks. We've covered a lot of ground, from what a witch means to the history of the witch trial. We've looked at demonology, we've looked at the stories of accused people and their accusers, and we've talked about witchcraft in contemporary culture today. I've really enjoyed delivering these lectures, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to them too. Please check out the link below for lots of additional resources where you can learn more about the topic of today's talk and the wider history of witchcraft.